All right, so we move on to the autonomic nervous system. And this system is mainly, functionally, has to do with maintaining homeostasis. So that's its major function, autonomic nervous system. Homeostasis cannot be maintained without the autonomic nervous system. And we'll see why shortly. So it's the portion of the nervous system that operates in comparative secrecy. What do you think that means?
Say that again.
It operates in comparative secrecy. It's involuntary, right? So we don't even know what it's doing and when it's doing it. Okay? So it's just monitoring the environment, the internal body environment, and also external, and making decisions on what to do about those stimuli or changes that need to be made in the body. And again, we don't know what's going on. For the most part, every now and then you can feel your heart rate increase, right? Somebody scares you, you get that adrenaline rush. That's the autonomic nervous system at work. So it manages a multitude of unconscious processes responsible for the body's homeostasis. General properties of the autonomic nervous system. It's a motor nervous system, so keep in mind that this is part of the motor division. Remember, we had somatic motor and visceral motor. What was the other name for the visceral motor division? The autonomic nervous system. So that's what we're talking about here. So what we're talking about when we say motor, so motor signals always start where? Not necessarily with brain, but CNS. Okay? Voluntary motor signals start in the brain. But now we're talking about somatic motor. So those start in the CNS. Some of them start in the spinal cord. Okay, so the autonomic nervous system controls glands. And again, think of the motor division. Motor division signals to what effectors? Glands, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Okay, so now we're talking about the involuntary control of these involuntary muscles, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, those muscles we really don't even know we have, and then our glands as well. And again, this is also called the visceral motor division. And visceral meaning what? So the word visceral means internal organs of the ventral body cavity. Good. Primary organs of the autonomic nervous system are the visceral, thoracic, and abdominal cavities, as well as some structures of the body wall, including the cutaneous blood vessels. When you see cutaneous, what does that make you think? Skin. Okay, so cutaneous means skin. So blood vessels of the skin, sweat glands, and piloerector muscles are some of those structures that the autonomic nervous system controls. And they are in the body wall. So not only viscera, but also those organs. Properties of the ANS: it carries out actions involuntarily, so again, without our control or conscious intent. Visceral effectors do not depend on the autonomic nervous system to function. That's another key. Think of what that means. Visceral effectors. So again, what are we talking about there? Right, so those smooth muscles and cardiac muscles do not depend on the ANS to function. What does that mean? So we're saying that the ANS has some effect on those. But exactly. So if you cut off all the autonomic nerve supply to those organs, such as the heart still beats. It's just going to, beat out of control. Okay? So the autonomic nervous system keeps it under control, causes it to increase if you're afraid, causes it to decrease if you're just sitting home watching a movie, unless the movie makes you excited. In a sense. So it's maintaining homeostasis. Right. So what it does, the nervous system kind of figures out, okay, what situation are you in? If there's no need for your heart rate to beat 200 beats per minute, it's going to slow it down. Okay, but if you're fighting, it's going to pick it up, speed it up. Okay, so the autonomic nervous system does what? It only adjusts the activity of those effectors based on what the body needs at that particular time. And an example of that is denervation, that just means cutting the nerve supply to the organs. And what happens when you cut the autonomic nervous system nerve supply to these effectors? It causes hypersensitivity. So that is an exaggerated response of cardiac and smooth muscle if the ANS nerves are severed. Okay? So there's kind of like a baseline of activity, and the ANS comes in just to keep the baseline level. And then it just increases if needed and decreases from there if needed. But if you don't have those, then it kind of just goes out of control at a higher rate. One example of the autonomic nervous system involves this reflex. And if you all remember reflexes, we have somatic reflexes and visceral reflexes. What do you think the difference is? You have a somatic motor division and a visceral motor division. Somatic reflex, visceral reflex. So the difference is going to be what? Voluntary and involuntary, which involves a difference in what? Effectors. Right? So the somatic reflex involves what effectors? Skeletal muscles. Visceral reflexes involve cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Okay? But you still have those same 5 components. Remember the 5 components of a reflex? Receptor, sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron, and effector. So here the thing that's different is the effector. Okay, and one example of how the visceral reflexes work with the autonomic nervous system is in what's called the baroreflex loop. And you all need to understand this thoroughly for the test. I'll ask you questions about it on the test. So this reflex helps the body to maintain blood pressure, again, without us even knowing it's working. And we'll see how it works. So the 5 components: receptor, sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron, effector. What I want you all to know are the 5 specific components of the baroreflex loop. So by baro, B-A-R-O, what does that refer to? Anybody have an idea? What is a barometer?
A blood pressure.
Yeah. Okay, so well, barometer measures atmospheric pressure. So baro refers to pressure. So the baroreflex loop controls blood pressure. Okay, so first part. So in this reflex, you have to activate a receptor. What type of receptor is activated? Stretch receptors, which are also called baroreceptors. You may want to write that down. So stretch receptors, actually you should say baroreceptors are stretch receptors. So why would they be called baroreceptors? Because their job is to detect changes in pressure. Okay, but really what they're detecting is blood pressure, right? But why the stretch? Why are they called stretch receptors, you think? Very good. So what a baroreceptor is activated when the blood vessel stretches to a certain point. Okay, so that's detecting stretch directly. but that stretching is caused by changes in the pressure. Okay? So there are stretch receptors detecting stretching of the blood vessels. So those baroreceptors are located in certain arteries very close to the heart. Okay, so once those baroreceptors are activated by being overstretched, they send a signal to some part of the brain by way of what type of neuron? Afferent neuron. So you have the receptor, afferent neuron, sensory neuron, right? And here what I need for you to know is what type of nerve these neurons are going to be found in. So remember, a nerve is a collection of neurons. So what nerve is carrying those signals, those sensory signals, to the brain? So the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay? So the afferent neurons are in the glossopharyngeal nerve. Glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay? Another way to say that is the afferent neurons of the baroreflex loop are in the glossopharyngeal nerve. The afferent neurons of the baroreflex loop are in the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, so those sensory neurons in the glossopharyngeal nerve transmits the signal to what? To the CNS, which is where the interneurons are. And what particular part of the CNS? The medulla oblongata. Okay, so you need to know that the interneurons of the baroreflex loop are found in the medulla oblongata. Okay, and look at the picture and see what happens next. So the interneuron. So remember what the function of the interneuron is? Exactly. So the CNS receives the information, interprets the information, and makes a decision on how to fix the problem. So now the brain, the medulla, has received a signal that the blood pressure is too high. Now, so what can it possibly do to decrease the blood pressure back to normal? So it decides, okay, the best way to do that, or the quickest way to do it, is to send a signal to the heart and make the heart slow down, beat slower. Okay? So really what is, if you're looking at this blood vessel, so the baroreceptor is here. So what causes that to expand? Right. So what is the ultimate cause of the increase in pressure? Right. The blood leaving the heart being pushed into those vessels. Right. So when the ventricle, the heart contracts, blood leaves the heart and goes into those vessels. So if it beats faster, guess what? Those blood vessels kind of feel like they're staying stretched. Okay. So every time the heart beats, the vessels do this anyway. Right? Every time the heart beats, they stretch. And then they relax, then they stretch, then they relax. So if they're stretching a lot, they just feel like they're what? Being stretched too much, never relaxing, kind of. So the brain sends a signal for the heart to contract slower, so at least it does get some relaxation time. Okay? 1 second. Let's finish this. So from the medulla, the signal goes to the heart, but what is sending it from the medulla to the heart? the motor neurons, which are inside what nerve? The vagus nerve. Okay, so the efferent or motor neurons that transmit the signal from the CNS medulla to the heart are in the vagus nerve. And then, yeah, the motor neurons that transmit the signal from the CNS, from the medulla, to the heart are in the vagus nerve. Okay, so the vagus nerve is responsible for getting that signal to what effector? The heart. Cardiac muscle. Okay, and that decreases heart rate. So that is the visceral reflex. Okay, and we'll see there are other mechanisms that help to decrease blood pressure. And now, again, when there is disease, if a person has hypertension, one of the problems is that the homeostatic mechanism is not working. Okay, so a lot of times when a person has a disease, there is a homeostasis mechanism to correct it, but sometimes it just doesn't work the way it's supposed to. It could be the signal, it could be the receptor is not getting activated at the right time. Okay, there were a couple hands up questions.
I had a heart murmur when I was little, and sometimes I exercise, it's like when I fight, and my eyes get really blurry, and my eyes get kind of blurry.
Well, a heart murmur has to do with the valves in the heart not closing all the way. So you may not have been injecting enough oxygenated blood. So the oxygenated blood level may not have been high enough, and the brain is very sensitive to a lack of oxygen. So anything like low pressure, and that may have been part of the problem, because I'll explain this better when we get to the heart chapter, but when the ventricles are what send blood out to your brain, but when they contract, all of the blood in the ventricle is supposed to go to the blood vessels, the arteries, to your brain. If you have a murmur, some of the blood is going back up in the heart, so some of it is not leaving the heart. So you get the point. So some of it is staying back behind in the heart, so your brain is not necessarily getting as much as it should. Another question?
Were you experiencing anything like this with your blood pressure? Don't it also have an effect like with your heart?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the same thing that's causing your blood vessels to stretch could be causing your heart to stretch. Okay, and the heart stretching, sometimes it's a good thing when you're exercising. So you do expect for your blood pressure to increase when you're exercising. That's a good thing. Getting exercise for your heart. But over time, if the heart stretches too much, then it loses its ability to contract. The reason we're able to move when our skeletal muscles contract is because our skeletal muscles are attached to what? Bones, right? So there's something pulling back on the muscle, but think of the heart. The heart is really holding itself together by those muscles being there, pulling on each other. So if you overstretch the heart, there's really nothing to pull back on the heart, so the heart stops pumping effectively.
So when the heart is enlarged, does that mean it's stretched, overstretched?
Well, no, that's a different situation. That's where there's too much muscle tissue, and that causes the heart rhythms to change. And most of that we'll get into in the heart chapters coming up later. But this is this is the barrel reflex loop, and example of homeostatic negative feedback. Okay, how is this negative feedback? Remember what negative feedback is? What is negative feedback? From 103 and 201. Negative feedback versus positive feedback.
Isn't it so reversed though? Negative is positive and positive is negative. You know what I'm trying to say? They're like the reverse.
I know what you're trying to say. So, can you think of, okay, if this is negative feedback,
Positive, negative feedback is when the body does it on its own. Positive is when something has to be placed in there. So make
Positive feedback is when you're going to labor. Something in your body helps you go into labor. It stresses it, exaggerates what's going on. And negative feedback is if you have a fever. Negative feedback will be your body sweating to release the heat,
okay,
or to bring your temperature down, or I don't.
no, you, okay. So what would, really with feedback, with both of them, you detect some change. The result is what's different. So the body detects a change, right? So what's being detected here?
Too high.
Blood pressure is too high. How does the body respond? By bringing it back to the set point. How would that be different with positive feedback? If there was a positive feedback mechanism for blood pressure, how would that be different from what happened here? So your blood pressure still detected the same way, it's still detected as being too high, but a positive feedback mechanism would what? It will make it keep going higher. So remember, negative feedback brings it back to normal. Positive feedback keeps exaggerating the effect in the same direction. Childbirth, for example. So you're detecting the contraction of the uterus. That stimulates the release of a hormone, oxytocin. Remember that? More oxytocin is released, causing more contractions. More contractions cause the release of more oxytocin, which causes even more contraction. So the effect is going higher and higher. And then body temperature. That's kind of where you learned about it. So with body temperature, what's the negative feedback doing? Process. First detecting that the temperature is too high and doing what? Doing something to bring it back down. What would positive feedback do to body temperature? It would detect that it's going up and then do what? Make it keep going even higher, which would be fatal. And there is an example of positive feedback with body temperature if it gets up to a certain point. Okay, so negative feedback brings blood pressure back down. Okay, so that is one, probably the only one you need to know as far as visceral reflex loop. Okay, divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So for most of what you need to know in this chapter is going to be what is the difference between the two subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Okay? And with you all going into nursing, this is something they hit on quite often. So I want you all to have an understanding of it. Try not to memorize, and I'll give you some tips on helping you to remember it without memorization so much. Okay, so the two divisions, first of all, I want you to understand how it works. So first, the autonomic nervous system signals start in the what? CNS, and go out to the effectors. So the effectors are innervated by both of these divisions, the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. What do you think that means? Can you give me an example of what that probably means? So both the sympathetic and parasympathetic division innervate the same target organ. Give me an example.
like causing the heart rate to increase and decrease.
Okay, good. So, as she said, the sympathetic division innervates the heart, but so does the parasympathetic division. Okay? But most of the effects are going to be what? Contrasting. Some of them are cooperative, and we'll mention a couple of those, but most of the effects of sympathetic and parasympathetic are opposite of each other. Okay, so the sympathetic division, its job is to prepare the body for physical activity, such as exercise, trauma, arousal, competition, anger, fear. So anything you can think of that causes your heart rate to increase is the sympathetic division causing your heart rate to increase. Okay, so when you're afraid, when you're fighting, when you're running from someone, when you get mad at somebody, exactly, when you're afraid, exactly. So those things are controlled by the sympathetic division. So what are some specific things? And this is mainly what I'll be asking you on the test. So the sympathetic division has what effect on the body? It increases heart rate, increases blood pressure, increases airflow, increases blood glucose level. Now that will I kind of explain. And at the same time, it reduces blood flow to the skin and digestive tract. Now, what I like to do is for you to think of a situation where your sympathetic division is at work. And I always use something extreme like a madman chasing you with a knife. So you're running down the street and this man has a big butcher knife chasing you. What do you want your organs inside to be doing at that time? Just think about it. So you want your heart rate to increase, but I want you to now think about why would you want your heart rate to increase while you're running from that man?
To make more energy.
Okay, so how does heart rate do any of that? So it increases blood flow. Right, so you want increased blood flow to where exactly?
Skeletal muscles.
So thank you. No, that's what I want you to think about. So if you're running from a man with a knife, you want as much blood going to your skeletal muscles so you can keep running and you don't just fall over and say, I give up. Right? So you need energy going to those muscle cells. So that's what your heart rate increases for, to get more blood flow to those muscles. And blood pressure. Again, we'll talk more about blood pressure. But if your blood pressure is low, then blood is not going to flow. Okay, just think of a water hose and there's low pressure in it. Water's just trickling out, whereas if there's high pressure, water is shooting out. So one thing to remember is anything that causes an increase in heart rate automatically increases what? Blood pressure. We just saw that with the reflex. Okay, you slow down the heart rate, you decrease blood pressure. Increase heart rate, you always increase blood pressure. Why do we want to increase airflow? Okay, so you all told me the increased heart rate is sending blood to the cells. But what is it in the blood that the cells need? Oxygen and glucose. So the sympathetic division increases airflow, bringing oxygen into the blood, more oxygen into the blood, and more glucose into the blood. Okay? Now, it also says the sympathetic division reduces blood flow to the skin and also to the digestive tract. And what you should think about here is there is not enough blood in the body to perfuse or send blood to all the tissues and then increase blood flow somewhere else without shutting it off somewhere else. Okay, so since we're increasing blood flow to the muscles, blood flow has to be decreased somewhere else. So the body makes a decision, okay, what doesn't need blood flow so much right now? At that time, you don't need blood flow to the skin. That's not going to save your life. And your digestive tract. Okay, so blood flow decreases in those areas that are not needed for that period of time. Okay? All right, and later on we'll see that whatever, for the most part, whatever is reduced by sympathetic is going to be increased by parasympathetic and vice versa. Okay, so when we think parasympathetic division, what it does is calms many body functions, reducing energy expenditure and assisting in bodily maintenance. So those times when you're just sitting at home relaxing, parasympathetic division kicks in, aiding in the digestive process and waste elimination. So it's referred to as rest and digest. So parasympathetic is called the rest and digest division. Sympathetic is called fight or flight. Okay, that's when they are most active. Okay, and you'll see autonomic tone, again, is the normal background rate of activity that represents the balance of the two systems. So again, for the most part, they're going to be balanced, and certain activities cause one to increase, and other activities cause the other to decrease. But when they're just balanced, that's called autonomic tone. Parasympathetic tone maintains smooth muscle tone. So the smooth muscles, just like our skeletal muscles, are never just completely relaxed. There's a muscle tone, which is just a slight contraction of the muscles. So you have the same thing here. And that is the job of the parasympathetic. Holds the resting heart rate down to about 70 to 80 beats per minute. Okay, so parasympathetic, as we said, is responsible for decreasing heart rate. Sympathetic tone keeps most blood vessels partially constricted to maintain blood pressure and blood flow. So the sympathetic division excites the heart but inhibits digestive and urinary function, while parasympathetic has the opposite effect of increasing digestive and urinary function and decreasing the heart rate. A couple more things here that you'll see in your book in a couple of slides. So where is the autonomic nervous system? Again, it carries a signal from what? The CNS, so this is the spinal cord, out to an effector here, which would be the heart. And this is comparing the somatic motor division to the visceral motor division. So in the somatic motor division, there was only one neuron taking the signal from the spinal cord out to the skeletal muscle. In the autonomic nervous system, there's going to be two motor neurons involved in getting the signal from the CNS out to an effector. So one thing to remember, the autonomic nervous system has two motor neurons that are necessary to get the signal from the CNS to the effector. That first neuron is called pre-ganglionic. The second one is called post-ganglionic. Okay? Pre-ganglionic and post-ganglionic. And notice, so remember what part of the spinal cord is this up here? Looking at the somatic efferent. So that's somatic motor neuron. This cell body is found in the ventral horn. But for the autonomic nervous system, the cell body is found in the lateral horn. Good. So I don't really ask that on the test, but at some point in the future you all may need to know that. Just like you know the sensory neurons are in the dorsal horn, motor neurons, ventral horn, and autonomic neurons are in the lateral. Cell bodies are in the lateral horn. Okay, a few other things about the sympathetic division. The sympathetic division is called the thoracolumbar division because it arises from the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. Thoracolumbar. So thoracal referring to thoracic, lumbar referring to the lumbar region. Okay? And they have relatively short preganglionic and long postganglionic fibers, which we'll see in the next slide. And again, the preganglionic neurons are in the lateral horns. Let's look at a picture here. So notice all of the preganglionic neurons are green. So notice what part of the spinal cord they're in. So the cervical region is green, part of the spinal cord. So notice there are no nerves coming off the cervical region. What about the lumbar, thoracic and lumbar? So thoracic region of the spinal cord is blue. So notice in the sympathetic division, most of the preganglionic neurons come off of the what? Thoracic region of the spinal cord, and also the lumbar region. So that's why it's called the thoracolumbar division, because that's where the neurons originate, in that part of the CNS. Okay, and what else did it say? It said the preganglionic neurons are what? Short, whereas the postganglionic neurons are in red. Notice they're long, and they go all the way to the organs that they're going to innervate. Okay, y'all got that? Now, how is that different from, and one other thing I didn't point out. So there's a chain ganglion here. So parallel to the spinal cord, the sympathetic division has a chain ganglion. And so you see the ganglia, these contain the cell bodies of the postganglionic neurons. So most of the postganglionic neurons have their cell bodies in the chain ganglion. So, and that's very close to the spinal cord. So that's why the second neuron carries the signal all the way to the organs, and the second neurons are long. Okay, this no big deal here, just to show you that the cell bodies are here in the lateral horn, and they get the signal to the chain ganglion, where the neurons there form a synapse with the cell body of the postganglionic neuron. Okay, and here you can see the chain ganglia. Now, what about the parasympathetic division? How is it different? The parasympathetic division is not called thoracolumbar, but it's called craniosacral. Why is it called craniosacral? Because their preganglionic neurons originate in either cranial nerves or the sacral region of the spinal cord. Okay? And the cranial nerves that carry these fibers are in the cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. And let's look at a picture here. So notice there are no nerves, coming off of the spinal cord except at the very bottom where we have the sacral region. So this is parasympathetic, and then up in the cranial nerves there. Okay, and notice the difference. The green neurons or nerves are long in the parasympathetic division. So in the sympathetic division, the preganglionic neurons are what? Short. In the parasympathetic division, the preganglionic neurons are long. But they have very short postganglionic neurons, which you really can't even see. Remember, the postganglionic neurons are red, and they're almost all the way at the organ. You can barely see them up here. Okay, and what were those cranial nerves involved with the parasympathetic division? 3, 7, 9, and 10. Okay. Now I'm going to jump all the way over here. So this is what you all need to start working on today. So get chapter 14. I don't mean that. You can't forget chapter 14. But catch up on 14 so you can start focusing on this. And I recommend you all making note cards here. But again, most of it, hopefully, most of them you can make sense of what your body should be doing when you're running from that madman with a knife. So let's start in those terms. So these are the sympathetic effects that I need for you to know for the test. Okay, I'm going to ask you, for example, what effect does the sympathetic division have on the bronchi and bronchioles? And that is bronchodilation. Why? To increase airflow. Okay. Let's start at the top. So sympathetic division does affect the iris. Where's the iris? So it's the color part of the eye, right? You all just had a test on that. So the color part of the eye is the iris. It has smooth muscle. And those smooth muscles can contract or dilate, or constrict or dilate the pupil. So the pupil is the center. Okay? So when the pupil dilates, more light comes into the eye. When it constricts, less light comes into the eye. So just imagine a man is chasing you, and it's probably not in broad daylight. It's probably about 1 in the morning or some weird time like that. So it's dark outside, and would you prefer, or do you think it would be best for your pupils to dilate or constrict? Dilate. Okay? So that allows more light to come in your eyes so you can see the tree and not run into the tree. Okay? Sympathetic division causes the sweat glands to do what? Secrete sweat. Secrete more sweat. Piloerector muscles. Right. Contraction of the muscle causes goosebumps. The heart increases heart rate and force for what? To increase blood flow. Good. Blood vessels of the skeletal muscle. Now, what are we talking about there? Exactly. So the skeletal muscles that you all said are going to need more ATP, are going to need more oxygen and glucose. So you want those blood vessels to deliver more blood to the muscles. So you want those blood vessels to dilate. Okay, so dilation of the blood vessels of the skeletal muscles. But what about the blood vessels of the skin? Exactly. So we don't need as much blood flow to our skin, so those vessels are constricted in those situations where we need more blood flow to the muscle. Bronchi and bronchioles, you just told me bronchodilation for more airflow. Now, these two have to do with parasympathetic. So again, remember, when we increase activity of sympathetic, that decreases anything to do with digestion and urinary removal. Okay, on the kidneys, reduces urine output. So the sympathetic division reduces urine output and decreases motility and secretion of the GI tract. What do you think motility means? Movement of the digestive tract, and that's just contraction of the muscles of the digestive tract. So that decreases. And on the liver, who can make sense of that? So the sympathetic division causes the liver to break down glycogen. Anybody want points?
I want I know you probably over so it's stored in the pancreas and it breaks the stored. I mean the stored energy in there. It breaks down that stuff. Yes, it breaks down stored in.
Isn't that sugar?
Is it the fat?
So what is glycogen?
It's sugar, right?
Is it stored glucose? Okay, so it breaks down the stored glucose in the
So
liver.
glycogen, how many of you all know what glycogen is? So glucose, what's the relationship between glycogen and glucose? They're both sugars, right? One is a mono. Which one is monosaccharide?
Glucose.
Glucose is the monosaccharide.
And it's the
Glycogen is
polysaccharide.
polysaccharide.
Right. So glycogen is the polysaccharide of glucose. So you stick a bunch of glucose molecules together to make one glycogen molecule. It's not starch. Starch is another type of polysaccharide. But when you eat 6 Krispy Kreme donuts, you don't need all that glucose. So some of it is stored in the liver as glycogen.
And then it breaks it down.
Okay, so the liver can release the glucose back into the blood when needed, whenever blood glucose starts to drop, or when you're running from that madman and your blood needs more glucose. Right? You're not eating while you're running, right? So where's the extra glucose coming from?
The glycogen.
Breaking down glycogen. So you're breaking down a polysaccharide to glucose. Okay, glycogen breakdown. And now, what does the pancreas have to do with anything? So the pancreas releases insulin normally, right? But what does the insulin do? What is insulin supposed to do?
Level your blood sugar.
Right, it reduces blood glucose. But now we don't want to decrease blood glucose, right? We need as much glucose going to our muscles. So the sympathetic division tells the pancreas not to secrete insulin because insulin would lower blood glucose. Okay? And also, the pancreas also functions in making enzymes for digestion. Anything to do with digestion is shut down by the sympathetic division. Okay, so the pancreas decreases insulin secretion and decreases digestive enzyme secretion. And this is the one that makes no sense. It doesn't fit into anything. The reproductive system, stimulation by the sympathetic division stimulates orgasm and relaxation of the uterus. So that's one that just really doesn't fit into the madman running down the street. Exactly. So the sympathetic stimulates orgasm, whereas parasympathetic stimulates penile and clitoral erection. So those are the effects on the reproductive system. And now, so the parasympathetic division causes what on the iris? Constriction of the iris. What on the heart? Decreased heart rate. Blood vessels of the skin? Vasodilation. Bronchi and bronchioles? Constriction. Good. Bladder wall? Contraction to release urine. GI tract? Increases activity. Liver?
So it makes it.
Good. Glycogen synthesis means to make glycogen. So it's pulling glucose out of the blood and storing it, making more glycogen. On the pancreas, it increases digestive enzymes, so you can break down those foods in your digestive tract. And as we said, on the reproductive, stimulation of penile and clitoral erection. Okay? All right. Yeah, I'm going to go over some more. There's a few things I need to go back to, because what I want you all to think about now, so now that you know this, I want you to think about, okay, so we said nerves are stimulating the heart, right? You have sympathetic and parasympathetic. Both of them are stimulating the heart, but one has one effect, the other has another effect. How can they have different effects? Well, there's different nerves, but think about how sympathetic speeds it up, parasympathetic slows it down. What must be different about those two sets of nerves? Tell me Thursday. I want y'all to tell me, think about it, and we'll talk about it on Thursday.